The first book of Samuel, the 24th chapter, and we'll begin by reading the 22 verses together. And it came to pass, when Saul was returned from following the Philistines, that it was told him, saying, Behold, David is in the wilderness of En-gedi. Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men out of all Israel, and went to seek David and his men upon the rocks of the wild goats. And he came to the sheepcotes by the way, where was a cave. And Saul went in to cover his feet, and David and his men remained in the sides of the cave. And the men of David said unto him, Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, Behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Then David arose and cut off the skirt of Saul's robe privily. And it came to pass afterward that David's heart smote him because he had cut off Saul's skirt. And he said unto his men, The Lord forbid that I should do this thing unto my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch forth mine hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord. So David stayed his servants with these words, and suffered them not to rise against Saul. But Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and cried after Saul, saying, My lord the king. And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed himself. And David said to Saul, Wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, Behold, David seeketh thy heart? Behold, this day thine eyes have seen how that the Lord had delivered thee today into my hand in the cave, and some bade me kill thee. But mine eyes spared thee, and I said, I will not put forth mine hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the skirt of thy robe in my hand, for in that I cut off the skirt of thy robe, and killed thee not. Know thou and see that there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand, and I have not sinned against thee. Yet thou huntest my soul to take it. The Lord judge between me and thee, and the Lord avenge me of thee, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. As saith the proverb of the ancients, wickedness proceedeth from the wicked, but mine hand shall not be upon thee. After whom is the king of Israel come out? After whom dost thou pursue? After a dead dog, after a flea. The Lord therefore be judge, and judge between me and thee, and see and plead my cause, and deliver me out of thine hand. And it came to pass, when David had made an end of speaking these words unto Saul, that Saul said, Is this thy voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept, and said to David, Thou art more righteous than I, for thou hast rewarded me good, whereas I have rewarded thee evil. And thou hast showed me this day how that thou hast dealt well with me, forasmuch as when the Lord had delivered me into thine hand, thou killest me not. For if a man find his enemy, will he let him go well away? Wherefore the Lord reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. And now behold, I know well that thou shalt surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. Swear now therefore unto me by the Lord that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me, and that thou wilt not destroy my name out of my father's house. And David sware unto Saul, and Saul went home, but David and his men gat them up unto the hold. Well, chapter 23 was a difficult chapter for David, and so too is chapter 24. And so we're going to commence by considering the severity of David's circumstances. The severity of David's circumstances. In verses 1 and 2 and 3, two great crises for David. Firstly, would Saul kill him? Secondly, should he kill Saul? Would Saul kill him? Can you imagine how great a trial that was for David? Saul and 3,000 men surround him. Humanly speaking, the odds are with Saul. Humanly speaking, the odds are against David. And then the tables are turned. And Saul becomes surrounded by David and his men. And now there's an opportunity for David. should he kill Saul? Can you imagine how great a temptation that was for him? And so the opening verses 1, 2 and 3, the severity of David's circumstances. And then in verse 4, the subjectivity of David's companions. We read at the start of verse 4 about the men of David. Would they have included all the 600 men who were mentioned in the previous chapter? Certainly there must have been a considerable number, and yet they speak with a single voice. They speak about the situation around them. They speak about a declaration to them. And there is no dissension among them, no disagreement, no dispute. As far as they're concerned, matters are very, very clear. Saul should be slain. That's their perspective. That's how they interpret things. That's their viewpoint. But it was their viewpoint, subjective, not objective. And in fact, it was faulty, not factual. It was very cloudy, not correct. But against that, thirdly, we have the spirituality of David's character. David spares Saul's life. Last time I was with you, we spent 2 sessions in 1 Samuel 17, the story of David and Goliath. What a great victory David won then. A victory celebrated immediately afterwards, and a victory that has been celebrated forever afterwards. But you know, greater than the victory of David in the valley in chapter 17 is this victory of David in the cave here in chapter 24. A greater exploit for David not to kill Saul than it was for him to kill the giant. It's been put like this: revenge restrained is a victory gained. And what a great victory was gained here. This has been described as David's greatest test, and he passes this greatest test, this most difficult of tests. He passes it with flying colours. All that he does do is cut off part of Saul's robe, and hardly has he done it before he regrets it. And so there is, fourthly, the sensitivity of David's conscience, the sensitivity of David's conscience. Things could, of course, have been so much different. He could have surrendered to what must have been the very loud voice of his flesh. He could have succumbed to what evidently was the loud voice of his friends. What if he had done so? What then? Well, we'll explore, fifthly, the superiority of David's choice. And then from verse 9 down to verse 15, David speaks to Saul. He reveals to him what he did not do, and then he reminds him of what the Lord would do. Verse 12, again in verse 15, the Lord judge between me and thee. And we'll call that the security of David's confidence. He leaves it all with the Lord. And then in verse 16, after David has spoken to Saul, Saul begins to speak to David, and he does so through tears. And as he weeps, he says, verse 19, the Lord reward thee good for that thou hast done unto me this day. Those are remarkable words. And then in verse 20, even more remarkable words. I know well that thou shalt surely be king. The kingdom of Israel shall be established in thine hand. At first sight, impressive. And so we would be tempted to ask, are the hostilities over? Is the enmity that Saul had for David, is that enmity now an end? Well, at first sight, quite impressive, but only at first sight. For we know from subsequent chapters that while on the part of Saul there may have been passing remorse, there was no permanent repentance. There may have been temporary conviction, but there was no true change. And it's clear from how the chapter ends that David, at this very moment of time, David recognised that. For we read that Saul went home, but David and his men went up unto the hold. There was no invitation by Saul to David to accompany him back to the palace. And so we'll think about the superficiality of David's challenger. And so this is our chapter, these are our headings: the severity of David's circumstances, the subjectivity of David's companions, the spirituality of David's character, the sensitivity of David's conscience, the superiority of David's choice, the security of David's confidence, and the superficiality of David's challenger. Well, as Stephen brought you to the end of chapter 23 last week, he pointed out that David and his men were surrounded by Saul and his men. All seemed hopeless. Defeat, destruction, doom appeared to be inevitable. And then the Lord himself intervened, just at that crucial, just at that psychological moment. Philistines invaded the land. A messenger comes to tell Saul, and Saul leaves one area for another. He stops pursuing David and he starts pursuing the Philistines. And that divine intervention allows David to escape, allows David to relocate. That was the end of chapter 23. Now at the start of chapter 24, having, it seems, dealt with the Philistines, Saul recommences his former pursuit. He will search for David. He wants to slay David. And so do you see Saul's ceaseless occupation. He just won't give up. He has a land to govern. He has duties to discharge. He has tasks to perform. But all these things are put to the side. His priority, his obsession, to search for and to slay David. And so do you see his ceaseless occupation? Do you see his ruthless organisation? David may have 600 men, but Saul has 3,000. David and his men are outnumbered 5 to 1. Put yourself in David's situation. This would be not at all pleasant. But do you see Saul's useless operation? David may be pursued by Saul, but David is going to be preserved. He's going to be protected by the Lord. Saul hates him. Saul hunts him, but Saul cannot hurt him. It seems that Saul was successful when he went to fight the Philistines, but Saul was unsuccessful when he went to find David. Verse 1 indicates that Saul had his spies, his informants, his scouts, but he just could not find him. And so, trial number 1, would Saul kill him? That first trial was external. The second trial is internal, and it takes the form of temptation. For into his cave comes Saul, and David must decide how to react, how to respond. Just think about it. The temptation was sudden. David did not see it coming. It was completely unexpected. The temptation was strange. Of all the caves that Saul could have entered, he enters this one. And the temptation, not only sudden and strange, it was strong. It was strong. In those moments, as David saw Saul, did he remember all the times that Saul had cast his javelin at him? Did he remember the price that Saul had demanded for his daughter's hand in marriage, a price that involved combat with the Philistines? Did he remember the messengers sent to his home to slay him? Just how many attempts had Saul made on his life? Did he then remember Saul's anger against Jonathan for defending him? Did he remember Saul's slaying of the priests? Could the temptation, in fact, be any stronger? David had the man and a motive and the means. And so do you see the severity of David's circumstances? In the words of the hymn, for him, trials dark on every hand. Of course, in it all, we have to see the providence of God. God is in control of all events. Here's a great quote. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. There is not a square inch in the whole domain of our human existence over which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry, mine. Now, from other passages, we see that the Lord controls the stars and he controls the sparrows. But from this very passage, we see that his sovereignty takes in the armies of the Philistines, where and how and when they attack Israel under his control. His sovereignty takes in the aggression of Saul and his men, whether his pursuit of David will be successful or unsuccessful under his control. His sovereignty even extends to the ablutions of Saul. If we are to understand that Saul went into the cave to relieve himself, even that under his control. And so in the severity of our circumstances, do not forget the sovereignty of God's control. No trial comes our way. No temptation comes our way unless he plans, unless he permits it. To quote Spurgeon, when you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. When you go through a trial, the sovereignty of God is the pillow upon which you lay your head. Now, that pillow may be tear-stained, but rest your head upon the pillow of God's sovereignty. God was in control of David's life. God is in control of your life. God was in control in David's life amid the severity of David's circumstances. But then, secondly, the subjectivity of David's companions. Now, David clearly understands that Saul has been brought into his presence by the Lord. We see that in what he says in verse 10. The Lord had delivered thee today into mine hand. And Saul comes to see that too in verse 18. When the Lord delivered me into thine hand. So that's David's interpretation. But David's men, the men of David, they interpret it slightly differently. They have a revised version of events. And how they see it is this. God not only has brought Saul into the cave, as far as they're concerned, God has brought Saul into the cave so that he might be slain. Now, in support of that interpretation, they quote God to David. They understand that logic itself would not be enough to convince him. And so they bring in the Lord. Behold, the day of which the Lord said unto thee, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thine hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Now, I have a Bible in front of me with marginal references. Maybe you have too. And so beside a verse, there can be references to other verses. And so, particularly if one verse quotes an earlier verse, well, there'll be a reference to it there in the margin. But the curious thing is this. There's no such references here. Scripture does not record an earlier occasion on which the Lord had said, behold, I will deliver thine enemy into thy hand, that thou mayest do to him as it shall seem good unto thee. Oh, in chapter 23, the Lord had said, I will deliver the Philistines into thine hand. But that was a statement relating to another time and to another place and to another group. And that promise had already been fulfilled. And so the men of David were either taking that previous statement and amending it considerably, twisting it considerably, or else they were just making this whole statement up. They were being subjective. They were saying what they thought needed to be said. They were assessing the situation from their own standpoint, from their own viewpoint, and that's a dangerous exercise. Here's Malcolm Horlock. We have to learn that seemingly helpful and convenient circumstances are not necessarily a guarantee of God's will and God's purpose for us. They may be allowed by the Lord as a test of our faith and purpose of heart. We need to exercise care how we interpret God's providential ways, to be careful what conclusions we draw from them. It's all too easy for us as David's men to mistake the opportunity of doing what fits in best with our own wishes for God's approval of what we're doing. The issue for us, as it was for David and his men, is, are we as God's people to be guided by circumstances alone, or by those circumstances read in the light of the principles and teachings of the Word of God? These men were being subjective. They were looking at circumstances alone and drawing their own conclusion. But in contrast to the subjectivity of David's companions, we note the spirituality of David's character. He will not kill Saul. He will not kill him. He will not slay him, despite the fact that the situation could be interpreted as suggesting that he should. Saul is alone. Saul is vulnerable. And he will not slay him, despite the fact that all these men around him, with one voice, state that he should do so. And so, we need to be careful of making decisions based just on circumstances. Just because something is possible does not mean that it is permissible. Just because I can does not mean that I should. F.B. Meyer said, opportunity does not make a wrong thing right. Here's some Shakespeare. Oh, opportunity, thy guilt is great. How many wrong things have been done because people were presented with the opportunity. Now, of course, absolutely nothing happens by chance. As we've said, God had very deliberately brought Saul into the cave. That must be so. That was so. But as we've thought already, God's purpose in so doing was not that Saul be killed. Rather, it was that David be tested. Here's Mr. Pink. God was in reality testing David's faith, testing his patience, testing his piety. The testing of his faith lay in submission to the word, which plainly says, thou shalt not kill. And God had given him no exceptional command to the contrary. So be careful about making decisions based just on circumstances. And don't just follow advice that you've been given. David was badly advised. And down the chapter, David asserts that Saul had been badly advised. Verse 9, wherefore hearest thou men's words, saying, behold, David seeketh thy heart. And beyond that, even be careful of making decisions based on the quoting of Scripture. Out of context, a text can become a pretext for anything, for everything. And so, in distinction from how David's men view the situation, David makes his decision like this. The God who set Saul on his throne must be the one who will remove Saul from his throne. I may have been anointed to take the kingdom after Saul, but I have no authority to take the kingdom from Saul. Oh, if the tables were turned, if the circumstances were the other way round, I know that Saul would not hesitate to kill me. That's why he's in the area. He's after me. But I may not, I cannot, I will not kill him. There's an expression used 3 times by David in this chapter. Verse 6, the Lord's anointed. Again, verse 6, the anointed of the Lord. Verse 10, he is the Lord's anointed. 3 times here in chapter 24. 4 times in chapter 26. 7 times in all. Saul is the Lord's anointed. And so that's how That's how David views the situation, the spirituality of David's character. Now, Saul enters the cave, and David and his men are in the sides of the cave. And so Saul was maybe watched by hundreds of eyes as he entered that cave. But David has been watched by so many more. Confronted by this challenge, presented with this strong temptation, what will he do? Well, he does the right thing. He does the right thing. And then the sensitivity of David's conscience. You know, as far as his friends were concerned, David hadn't gone far enough. But as soon as he does it, cuts off the skirt of Saul's robe, David's conscience smites him, and he feels that he's gone too far. You see, with part of his robe removed, Saul would appear disgraced, and more than that, with part of his robe removed, Saul would appear dishonoured. Do you remember back in chapter 15, after Samuel had solemnly informed Saul that the Lord had rejected him from being king, as Samuel turned from him, Saul laid hold of Samuel's robe and it tore. And Samuel saw that as significant. Samuel saw that as symbolic. The Lord hath rent the kingdom of Israel from thee this day. And so the actions of David in cutting off part of the robe could be interpreted as David laying claim to the kingdom. And so his conscience is smitten. In the New Testament, 1 Timothy 4, we read about people whose conscience is seared with a hot iron, no longer sensitive to sin. But David, his conscience operates and his conscience smites him. Was it the Puritans who used to say, keep short accounts with God? Warren Veersby puts it like this: a sensitive conscience is a great treasure and a valuable guide. Don't lose it. So David does not kill Saul, and remarkably he persuades all his men not to kill Saul. Verse 7, David stayed his servants. That word stayed actually means, according to my margin, cut off or to tear, a strong word. Literally, we could put it like this: David tore into them. He restrained them. He held them back. And at the end of verse 7, Saul rose up out of the cave and went on his way. As David saw him go, I wonder what he was thinking. I'm sure that as the men of David saw him go, at least some of them must have thought, what fools we have been. We should just have slain him. Well, if they had done so, if Saul had been killed, what then? What then? What would have happened? Now, remember that Saul has his 3,000 men. If he were slain, would they just have melted away? Would David and his men not still have faced danger? But let's just say that the followers of Saul would have gone away. What would that have meant for David? Well, it would have meant that the days and the weeks and the months that became years on the run would have been over. The trouble's gone. The throne gained. But would those ends justify the means? Here's a quote by C.H. Bright. What a critical moment it was in David's history. Had he listened to the counsellors who urged upon him to do what Providence seemingly had put in his way, his life of faith would have come to an abrupt end. One stroke of his sword and he steps into a throne. Farewell poverty, farewell the life of a hunted goat. Reproaches, sneers, defeat would cease. Adulations, triumphs, riches would be his. But his at the sacrifice of faith. At the sacrifice of a humbled will, ever waiting on God's time. At the sacrifice of 1,000 precious experiences of God's care, God's provision, God's guidance, God's tenderness. No, even a throne at that price is too dear. Faith will wait. Had David killed Saul, would he have ever sung again? Had David killed Saul, would he have ever penned another psalm again? Someone has said, nearly all our falls come from trying to go before God. Nearly all our falls come from trying to go before God. Was that not what Abraham and Sarah did? God had promised them a son. And after waiting so long, they could wait no longer. But with disastrous consequences for them, for the nation, and for the world. The hymn writer gives us this advice: put thou thy trust in God. In duty's path go on. Walk in his strength with faith and hope, so shall thy work be done. Commit thy ways to him, thy works into his hands, and rest on his unchanging word, who heaven and earth commands. Though years on years roll on, his covenant shall endure. Though clouds and darkness hide his path, his promised grace is sure. Give to the winds thy fears, hope and be undismayed. God hears thy sighs and counts thy tears. God shall lift up thy head. Though waves and clouds and storms, his power, through waves and clouds and storms, his power will clear the way. Wait thou his time. The darkest night shall end in brightest day. Leave to his sovereign sway to choose and to command. So shalt thou wondering own his way. How wise, how strong his hand. Wait thou his time. And that can be so difficult. But David knew the importance of waiting. Here's what he writes in Psalm 37. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, neither be thou envious against the workers of iniquity, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Commit thy way unto the Lord, trust also in him, and he shall bring it to pass. Rest in the Lord, wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way. Evildoers shall be cut off, but they that wait upon the Lord, they shall inherit the earth. For yet a little while, and the wicked shall not be. Wait on the Lord, and keep his way, and he shall exalt thee to inherit the land. You know, there came a time, years later, 2 Samuel 16, when a man called Shimei cursed David and said that the current troubles of his life were the consequence of what he had done to the house of Saul. But that accusation was untrue, unfair, unjust. But you know, had David acted otherwise here in this chapter, had he slain Saul, then that accusation would have echoed around the country and echoed down through the centuries. Alan Redpath wrote, how easy to take the initiative, how hard to wait for God, how painful perhaps are the circumstances, but how much more painful are the consequences of action outside God's will. Here's another quote. How can any good come in the end from forcing forward arrangements out of the divine order? There is no impatience in heaven for a speedier fulfillment of desirable events than the will of God has ordained. No impatience in heaven for a speedier fulfillment of desirable events than the will of God has ordained. And so the man after God's own heart was prepared to wait God's time, wait for God to work. And ultimately, he did so. And he himself, without any involvement from David, he himself removed Saul from the throne. The superiority of David's choice. The counsel of David's men was not sensible, still involved risk, and it certainly was not spiritual. And so we're reminded, it's never wrong to do what's right. It's never bad to do what's good. Saul leaves the cave and David goes after him. Do you see the respect David showed him? Verse 8, my lord the king. Verse 11, my father. In what he says and in what he does, at the end of verse 8, he bowed himself before him. Do you see the respect David showed him? And then do you see the revelation David shared with him? Behold, verse 10. the Lord delivered thee today into mine hand. He had been encouraged to slay him, but he had rather spared him. David says, I have done nothing. Verse 11, there is neither evil nor transgression in mine hand. I have not sinned against thee. Verse 13, David quotes what even back then was an ancient proverb. Wickedness proceedeth from the wicked. In other words, if a man does evil, it's an indication that he is evil. In other words, by their fruits shall ye know them. David says, I have done nothing. David says, I am nothing. Verse 14, you are the king of Israel. And what am I? Just a dead dog, just a single flea. Says David, I am innocent. I've done nothing. Says David, I am inconsequential. I am nothing. Done nothing, am nothing. And then, do you see the reminder that David spoke to him? Not just the respect he showed him, not just the revelation he shared with him, but the reminder that David spoke to him. Verse 12, and again verse 15, the Lord will judge, and the Lord will avenge. I was speaking a few months ago to people in Northern Ireland, people who have dealings with victims of terrorism. And they said that these victims are often troubled at the thought that those who murdered their loved ones will never be held to account. Well, that might be the case in time. That won't be the case in eternity. Men may shut their eyes, men may close their ears to the cries of those victims, to the demands of justice. But God cannot and God will not. Victims will be avenged. Now, remarkably, centuries before these words were written, David demonstrated the truth of them by what he did. And then he declared the truth of them by what he said. These are words found in Romans 12. Recompense to no man evil for evil, provide things honest in the sight of all men. If it be possible, as much as lieth in you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourself, but rather give place unto wrath, for it is written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. Therefore, if thine enemy hunger, feed him. If he thirst, give him drink, for in so doing thou shalt heap coals of fire on his head. Be not overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good. The security of David's confidence. So David speaks. Saul hears him out. He does not interrupt. And then he weeps. End of verse 16. He weeps and then he begins to speak. He begins by comparing their respective righteousnesses. Thou art more righteous than I. That's a strange statement. But then he does go on to admit his guilt. I have rewarded the evil. And so do you hear his confession. He acknowledges his guilt. He acknowledges David's goodness. Do you understand his comprehension? Verse 20. Thou shalt surely be king. And then do you see his concern? Verse 21. Swear that thou wilt not cut off my seed after me. And David sware unto him. And David kept that vow. And yet the way that the chapter ends indicates that David was not convinced. Saul went home. David and his men went unto the hold. You see, confession but no real contrition. And as chapter 26 opens, it opens in the very same way as chapter 24, with Saul and 3,000 men seeking for David. Now, the period may be different, it's later. The place may be different, it's elsewhere, but the practice is just the same. In chapter 26, despite what Saul has said at the end of chapter 24, Saul is on the hunt for David. You know, it's been said, the evidence of sins forgiven is sin forsaken. We can say, the evidence of a change of heart is a change of life. And with Saul, that was just not the case. There was no change of life. Tears may have filled his eyes, but hatred soon again filled his heart. And so the chapter closes the superficiality of David's challenger. And so those are my thoughts on the chapter that's been before us. 1 Samuel 24, a very practical chapter, a very pertinent chapter, a very probing chapter. It's unlikely to take place in a cave, but in some place or another, we will be tested in a similar way. And so it's useful to look at this chapter and in it to see the severity of David's circumstances, the superficiality of David's companions, the subjectivity of David's companions, the spirituality of David's character, the sensitivity of David's conscience, the superiority of David's choice, the security of David's confidence, and the superficiality of David's challenger. May the Lord bless his word.